The whisper hook. There's a name nobody is saying out loud right now. A country nobody is pointing at. A hand nobody is showing on camera. Everyone is watching Iran. Everyone is talking about drones and missiles and burning embassies. But somewhere in all that noise, in all that fire and smoke and breaking news, the real story is hiding in plain sight. And it starts not in Tehran, not in Washington, but in a conversation that was never supposed to happen, between two countries that officially pretended each other did not exist. For 70 years, Iran claimed responsibility. The news moved on. Officials issued statements. Condemnations were published. And the story, as presented to you on your television screen and in your social media feed, became simple. Iran attacked Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a victim. Move on. Nothing unusual here. But what if that story, clean, tidy, packaged, and delivered, is missing something? Not a small something. Not a footnote. A fundamental, structurally critical piece of the picture that changes everything. What if the chain of events that led to Iranian drones over Riyadh was not spontaneous? Sauce not purely reactive and not the result of Iranian aggression alone? What if someone else was in the room where this was designed? What if the real question is not who fired the missiles, but who made sure the missiles would be fired? And what if that someone is a country most people would never point to as a threat to Saudi Arabia? A country that has spent the last decade quietly building one of the most consequential secret relationships in modern geopolitical history, a relationship with Riyadh itself? What if Israel struck Saudi Arabia, not with missiles, not with bombs, but with something far more powerful, with strategy, with intelligence, with a decades-long patient plan executed so brilliantly, so invisibly, that when it finally detonated, it looked exactly like someone else's fault? Stay with me. Because this story does not begin in February 2026. It does not begin with Trump's war on Iran or Netanyahu's airstrikes on Tehran. This story begins in 1948. And once you understand where it starts, the ending, the burning embassy, the panicked diplomats, the Saudi capital under siege, stops looking like an accident and starts looking like a masterpiece. When the State of Israel was born in May 1948, the Arab world did not celebrate. Saudi Arabia voted against Israeli statehood at the United Nations. Saudi religious leaders declared the Zionist project an abomination. Saudi Arabia joined the broader Arab boycott of Israel. Officially, for the next 7 decades, Israel did not exist in Saudi Arabia's world. There were no embassies, no trade relationships, no diplomatic communications. In the mosques of Riyadh, in the official statements of Saudi kings, in every public-facing document the kingdom produced, Israel was not a neighbor. It was a problem, an illegitimate occupier, an enemy. But in intelligence work, official positions are almost irrelevant. What matters is interest. What matters is survival. And here is a fact of Middle Eastern geopolitics that has been true since the 1950s, and that both sides understood with cold clarity. Saudi Arabia and Israel shared one overwhelming, defining strategic interest. They were both terrified of the same things. They were both threatened by the same forces. Gamal Abdel Nasser and his pan-Arab nationalism, which threatened to sweep away both the Saudi monarchy and the newly born Israeli state. Soviet penetration of the Arab world, which neither country wanted. The rise of revolutionary movements that could destabilize every regime in the region. And above all, else eventually, irreversibly, permanently, Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran, born in 1979, which declared itself the enemy of both Israel and of Saudi Arabia's brand of Gulf monarchy. Iran, whose proxies launched rockets at Israeli cities. Iran, whose Houthi allies fired ballistic missiles at Riyadh. Iran, whose nuclear program threatened to detonate the entire regional balance of power. Saudi Arabia and Israel did not need to like each other to understand that Iran was the common enemy, and common enemies create uncommon alliances. By the 1980s, those quiet back channels between Saudi and Israeli intelligence, channels that had no official existence and certainly no public acknowledgement, were carrying serious information. The kind of information that saves lives. The kind of information that shapes military planning. By the 1990s, after the Oslo Accords created a window of optimism about broader Middle Eastern peace, there were tentative face-to-face meetings. Senior officials. Always in third countries, always completely deniable. Jordan hosted some, Washington hosted others. The Saudis needed to know what Israel knew about Iran's military program. Israel needed to know what Saudi intelligence was picking up from inside the Gulf. Both sides had things the other desperately wanted, so they traded, quietly, invisibly, in the shadows where the real Middle East actually operates. But then came Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the crown prince who would remake Saudi Arabia in his own image, for better and for worse, and sometimes for both, simultaneously. When MBS effectively took control of the kingdom's day-to-day governance around 2017, he brought with him a perspective on Israel that was genuinely, historically revolutionary for a Saudi leader. He looked at the Middle East and he saw not Israel as the core problem. He saw Iran. He saw the Houthi rebels Iran was arming in Yemen, who were launching ballistic missiles at Saudi cities and attacking Saudi oil infrastructure with drones. He saw the popular mobilization forces in Iraq, Iranian-backed militias that threatened Saudi supply lines and influence. He saw Hezbollah in Lebanon growing stronger every year, a state within a state armed with more missiles than most actual countries. He saw Iran spinning centrifuges and enriching uranium toward a bomb that, if achieved, would fundamentally alter the regional balance of power forever. And he saw Israel, battle-hardened, technologically brilliant, nuclear-armed, intelligence-rich, and equally consumed with stopping Iran. And he thought something no Saudi leader had ever formally thought before. I need that country on my side. The Abraham Accords of 2020, brokered by Jared Kushner in the final year of Trump's first term, normalized Israel's relationships with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. The Arab Street grumbled. Palestinian leaders were furious, but the deals held. And in every private conversation between American officials, Saudi officials, and Israeli officials, the same question hung in the air. When does Saudi Arabia sign? Because Saudi normalization with Israel would be categorically different from anything that had come before it. The UAE and Bahrain were significant. Saudi Arabia would be seismic. Saudi Arabia is the custodian of Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. Saudi Arabia is the spiritual and symbolic center of the Sunni Muslim world. If Saudi Arabia says Israel is a legitimate state, a legitimate partner, a country the Arab world can do business with, that changes the moral mathematics of the entire conflict. That ends, in a very real cultural and political sense, the 70-year Arab war against Israel's existence. For Israel, Saudi normalization was not just a diplomatic prize. It was the ultimate validation, the closing of a wound that had been bleeding since 1948, and MBS was willing to do it. Under conditions, those conditions were two things. First, a credible path toward Palestinian statehood, something he could show his people and the Muslim world as evidence that normalization was not a betrayal of Palestine. Second, an American security guarantee of such magnitude, backed by such an overwhelming delivery of military hardware that Saudi Arabia would be genuinely protected from the Iranian retaliation that normalization would inevitably provoke. Because MBS was not naive. He understood that the moment Saudi Arabia officially recognized Israel, when Iran would treat it as an act of war, every Iranian proxy in the region would be pointed at Saudi targets. The threat level would go through the roof, so MBS needed a shield, a real one, tested, proven, enormous. And that is exactly what the $100 billion American arms deal was designed to be. Think about the sequence of events. Trump visits Riyadh in May 2025. The arms deal is announced. $100 billion in weapons, Patriot missile systems, THAAD batteries, laser-guided rockets, advanced fighter jet components, surveillance drones, cybersecurity infrastructure, and whispers of a nuclear energy cooperation deal that could eventually give Saudi Arabia uranium enrichment capability. $600 billion in total commercial commitments. The largest bilateral economic agreement in the history of the two countries. All of it announced with great ceremony, with golden chandeliers and lavish banquets and handshakes for the cameras. And all of it underneath the pageantry, pointing at one thing: Iran. Every single weapon system in that package was designed, selected, and priced based on the Iranian threat. The THAAD system intercepts exactly the kind of ballistic missiles Iran fires. The laser-guided precision rockets counter exactly the kind of cheap drones Iran's Houthi proxies use. The air defense radars are calibrated for exactly the kind of electronic warfare signatures that Iranian military hardware produces. This was not a general-purpose arms deal. This was an anti-Iran arsenal, bought and paid for. And Iran was watching every press conference, reading every fact sheet, counting every zeros on every announced contract. Now fast forward to the weeks before February 28, 2026. The Washington Post, citing 4 separate sources familiar with the matter, reports something that deserves far more attention than it received. Donald Trump did not decide to launch a massive joint military assault on Iran because of a sudden intelligence threat or an imminent Iranian attack on American soil. He decided to launch it after a weeks-long lobbying campaign by 2 countries, Israel and Saudi Arabia. The 2 countries most threatened by Iran. The 2 countries whose back-channel relationship had been building for decades. The 2 countries whose strategic interests had been converging for years. Together, they pushed America into the biggest Middle Eastern military operation in a generation. Think about what that means. Think about the implications of that single-sourced, documented fact. The war that brought Iranian missiles raining down on Riyadh was a war that Saudi Arabia helped create. Saudi Arabia lobbied for the conditions of its own attack. Or did it? Because here's where the story fractures. Here's where the hidden hand becomes visible if you are willing to look. Saudi Arabia and Israel both wanted Iran's military power destroyed. That was genuine. That was shared. On that goal, they were completely aligned. But here's where their interests begin to diverge. Saudi Arabia wanted Iran neutralized, and then wanted to step back, to return to a position of comfortable Gulf dominance, to use the American weapons as deterrents rather than consumables, to manage the Iran threat from a safe distance, protected by American hardware and American guarantees. Saudi Arabia did not want a regional conflagration. It did not want Iranian missiles over Riyadh. It had been telling Iran explicitly, repeatedly, on the record, "We will not let our territory be used against you." Saudi Arabia wanted to be the country that pulled the strings from safety. Saudi Arabia wanted the outcome without the consequence. But Israel? Israel had a different calculus entirely. Israel has always understood something about existential conflicts that comfortable, large, wealthy nations tend to forget. You cannot have the outcome without the consequence. You cannot reshape a region without breaking things. You cannot force a realignment of historic proportions, the kind that ends with Saudi Arabia formally recognizing and partnering with the Jewish state, without crisis, without fire, without the kind of fear that strips away decades of political pretense and forces leaders to make decisions they would never make in peacetime. Israel has never been afraid to be the catalyst. That is not an insult. That is a historically documented pattern of behavior going back to the founding of the state. Israel fires first when it believes waiting will cost more than acting. Israel creates facts on the ground. Israel moves fast, strikes hard, and then watches the world reorganize around what it has done. Osirak in 1981. The Syrian nuclear facility in 2007. The assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists on Iranian streets. The Stuxnet cyber attack that destroyed Iranian centrifuges from the inside. Israel does not wait. Israel does not ask permission. Israel acts. So when the IDF publishes its own after-action statement saying that its intelligence officers spent thousands of hours compiling targets for the Iran strikes, that they tracked Iranian commanders with precision location data, that they identified the exact operational window when senior regime officials would be gathered together, you have to ask yourself a question that nobody in the mainstream media is asking loudly enough. Did Israel share all of that intelligence with Saudi Arabia? Did Israel give Saudi Arabia the full picture of what Iran's retaliation would look like? Did Israel tell Riyadh that if America strikes Iran, every Gulf Arab capital will become a target? Because if Israel told Saudi Arabia the full truth, that pushing for this war would bring Iranian drones to the diplomatic quarter, Saudi Arabia might have pulled back, might have quietly stopped lobbying Washington, might have decided the risk was too high. But if Israel framed the intelligence selectively, if Israel showed Saudi Arabia the parts of the threat picture that said Iran is vulnerable, Iran will fold quickly, this will be over in days, or then Saudi Arabia moves forward, pushes America into the war, and walks straight into the trap. That is not a confirmed accusation. Let me be clear about that. There is no document that proves Israeli intelligence was shared selectively with Riyadh. What there is, what is documented, sourced, and public, is that Saudi Arabia lobbied for a war it was clearly not prepared for the consequences of. What is documented is that Iran's retaliation was far wider, far faster, and far more willing to strike Gulf Arab states than Saudi Arabia publicly anticipated. What is documented is that Saudi Arabia told Iran it would not let its territory be used to target Iran, a promise that required Iran's cooperation, and that Iran ignored that promise completely and without hesitation. Saudi Arabia was caught genuinely off guard by the speed and the reach of Iran's response. That is not the behavior of a country that was fully briefed on what was coming, and the country best positioned to have provided, or withheld, that briefing was Israel. Now let us talk about what Israel gains, because in any question of geopolitical manipulation, the test is always the same. Follow the incentive, follow the outcome. Who ends up better positioned when the smoke clears? America is spending enormous financial and military resources on a conflict in a region it has been trying to reduce its exposure to for 15 years. America loses service members. America strains military supply chains. America watches domestic gas prices rise. America's president, who promised to end endless wars, is talking about boots on the ground in Iran. America is not winning from this in any clean, obvious way. Saudi Arabia is getting bombed despite its attempts at neutrality. Its refineries are on fire. Its embassy is burning. Its air defenses are consuming missiles at an extraordinary rate. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, the ambitious economic modernization program that requires domestic stability and investor confidence, is now being developed under the sound of air raid sirens. Saudi Arabia is not winning cleanly either. Iran is absorbing catastrophic strikes, losing its supreme leader, losing its nuclear facilities, losing infrastructure it spent decades building. Iran is not winning at all, but Israel. Let us look at Israel. Iran's most sophisticated long-range missile stockpiles are being degraded by American firepower. Iran's air defenses are being overwhelmed. The IRGC's command structure has been decapitated. Iran's nuclear program, the program that Israeli leaders have called an existential threat for 30 years, is being destroyed not by Israeli airstrikes alone, which could only have done so much, but by the overwhelming industrial-scale military power of the United States Air Force and Navy. Israel is getting something it could never have achieved unilaterally. And simultaneously, every Gulf Arab state that has just been hit by Iranian missiles is suddenly more desperate for security cooperation with the most militarily capable country in the region, which is Israel. Saudi Arabia just had its capital bombed despite American protection. Qatar had missiles fired at its airport despite hosting the largest American airbase in the entire Middle East. Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, all of them scrambling to intercept Iranian drones. And right there, offering the most sophisticated air defense technology in the world, offering real-time intelligence sharing, offering battle-proven military coordination, is Israel. This is not coincidence, this is positioning. This is the long game being played at the highest possible level. There is a concept in intelligence work called a beneficial crisis. It is exactly what it sounds like. A crisis that, while genuinely destructive and dangerous, produces strategic outcomes that serve the interests of a particular actor. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a beneficial crisis for American global leadership. It demonstrated U.S. resolve and ultimately strengthened the Western alliance. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 was a beneficial crisis for Saudi Arabia. It demonstrated the kingdom's economic power and forced the world to take Gulf Arab interests seriously. Every major geopolitical actor in history has, at various points, recognized that certain crises, even painful ones, accelerate outcomes that years of patient diplomacy cannot achieve. The question being whispered in intelligence circles right now, the question that Saudi officials are quietly investigating and that American analysts are slowly beginning to articulate, is whether Israel engineered a beneficial crisis. A crisis that burned Saudi Arabia just enough to push it across the threshold. Not enough to destroy it, not enough to topple the monarchy. Just enough fire, just enough fear, just enough demonstrated Iranian capability to strike anywhere in the Gulf. To make Saudi Arabia conclude that the only viable path forward is full, formal public partnership with Israel. Look at the historical parallel and tell me it does not give you chills. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel destroyed the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces in a single morning and seized the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. The Arab world was stunned, humiliated, furious. And within 6 years, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, who had fought Israel in 1973, had concluded that the path to recovering Egyptian dignity and territory ran through Washington, not through Moscow or through military confrontation. By 1979, he had signed the Camp David Accords, peace with Israel, the first Arab state ever to do so. He was assassinated by Egyptian extremists who called him a traitor. But the peace held. It held because Sadat understood after the trauma of war that the new reality required a new strategy. Saudi Arabia is being pushed toward the same conclusion by the same mechanism. Not immediately, not openly, but the trajectory is undeniable. The direction of travel is clear, and Israel knows exactly where the road leads. Here's the prediction. Here's what the logic of everything we have just discussed points toward. Within 18 months of this conflict reaching some kind of pause or resolution, Saudi Arabia and Israel will announce normalization. It will be presented as a diplomatic triumph, the historic breakthrough that the Abraham Accords always pointed toward. MBS will frame it as Saudi strength, not Saudi capitulation. Netanyahu will call it the fulfillment of the Zionist dream of acceptance in the broader Middle East. And there will be a Palestinian element to the announcement, some framework, some language, some carefully crafted diplomatic formula that gives MBS political cover to claim he did not abandon Palestine. On Shum, it will satisfy almost nobody on the Palestinian side, but it will be enough political cover to allow the deal to close. The normalization that was inching forward before the war will sprint across the finish line because of the war. The crisis created the urgency. The urgency created the deal. And the deal was what Israel needed all along. But let us not reduce this to cold strategy and bloodless geopolitics, because real people are living in the middle of this. Real families in Riyadh woke up to the sound of explosions. Real oil workers in the eastern province watched drones try to set their refinery on fire. Real diplomats in the American embassy compound ran for shelter when 2 drones punched through their walls at 3 a.m. Real Saudi air defense operators worked through the night, intercepting missiles over their capital city, over their airport, over the infrastructure that sustains their entire nation. These are not chess pieces. These are human beings caught inside a geopolitical strategy so large, so long in its construction, and so invisible in its operation that the people being moved around the board have no idea they are in a game. And the Saudi public, 35 million people who are being told a story about Iranian aggression and American protection and Saudi resilience, they deserve to know the rest of the story. They deserve to know that their own government apparently lobbied for the conditions of the attack their cities just endured. They deserve to know that the alliance their government has been quietly building with Israel for years may have placed them directly in the line of Iranian fire. They deserve to know that the $100 billion in weapons their government is buying from America is both a shield and a down payment on a political transformation that their parents and grandparents spent their entire lives opposing. They deserve to know that the war being fought around them, above their cities, inside their embassies, over their oil refineries, is not just a war about Iran's nuclear program or American security guarantees. It is a war about the final shape of the Middle East. And the final shape of the Middle East is looking increasingly like one in which Israel sits at the center. Consider the nuclear dimension, because it cannot be ignored. Congressional documents reviewed by the Associated Press reveal that the proposed American-Saudi nuclear deal, part of the broader partnership being negotiated alongside the arms package, could allow Saudi Arabia to enrich uranium on its own soil. The same America that is bombing Iran specifically to prevent it from enriching uranium is potentially offering Saudi Arabia the exact same capability. The same America that has imposed sanctions, threats, and now military strikes on Iran for its nuclear ambitions is potentially handing the building blocks of those ambitions to Iran's most powerful rival. If you think that is a coincidence, if you think that is an oversight, if you think that nobody in Washington or Jerusalem thought through the implications of that, you're not thinking about this clearly enough. A nuclear-capable Saudi Arabia, protected by American hardware and intelligence sharing with Israel, is the final deterrent against Iranian regional dominance. It is the ultimate insurance policy. And it is exactly the kind of end state that Israel, which has lived under the shadow of potential Iranian nuclear attack for decades, would be very comfortable with. Not a Saudi bomb necessarily, but the possibility of a Saudi bomb. The credible threat. The uncertainty that Iran would have to factor into every future military calculation. We are watching, in real time, the construction of a new regional architecture. It has been built quietly, patiently over decades of secret meetings and intelligence sharing and back-channel diplomacy. It has been accelerated by a war that may or may not have been engineered, but that certainly serves specific interests with remarkable precision. And at the center of it, connecting all the threads, the arms deals, the normalization track, the Iranian strikes on Saudi Arabia, the CIA station burning in Riyadh's diplomatic quarter, the Strait of Hormuz chokehold on the global economy. At the center of all of it is a question that the world has not yet worked up the courage to ask out loud, in public, with full accountability. Did Israel play Saudi Arabia? Did the country that Saudi Arabia has been quietly, carefully, secretly moving toward, the country it has been building a hidden alliance with, the country whose weapons and intelligence and military capability it was preparing to formally embrace, did that country manipulate events to make Saudi Arabia more desperate, more afraid, more willing to sign on the dotted line? The honest answer is, we do not know, not with certainty, not with the kind of documented proof that a court of law would require. What we have is pattern. What we have is incentive. What we have is a sequence of events that fits one strategic framework with extraordinary precision. What we have is a country, Israel, that has a documented, decades-long history of using intelligence, superiority, strategic patience, and precisely timed military action to reshape its regional environment. What we have is another country, Saudi Arabia, that is now in a position of fear, dependency, and urgent need for security that it was not in 12 months ago. What we have is a normalization deal that was moving slowly before the war and will move very quickly after it. And what we have is a fire in the diplomatic quarter of Riyadh that somebody is going to have to explain. Not the fire from the Iranian drones. That explanation is simple. Iran fired. We know that. That is documented. That is not the mystery. The mystery is the fire that was burning long before the drones arrived. The invisible fire of a decades-long shadow war between the two countries that officially pretended each other did not exist. The fire of secret meetings and shared intelligence and whispered strategy and enormous financial transactions. The fire of a plan so large, so patient, so carefully constructed that it took 70 years to fully ignite. And when it finally did, it looked, from a distance, like someone else had struck the match. Did Israel strike Saudi Arabia to force a war? Not with missiles, not with bombs, but with the most powerful weapon in the history of statecraft: information, patience, and the willingness to let someone else pay the price for a future you designed. The drones over Riyadh were Iranian. The fire at the embassy was Iranian. The missiles over the oil refineries were Iranian. But the conditions that made all of it inevitable, the arms deal, the lobbying for war, the years of quiet coordination between Riyadh and Tel Aviv, the strategic architecture that positioned Saudi Arabia directly in the line of Iranian fire at exactly the moment it needed to be. Those conditions did not build themselves. Someone designed them. Someone benefited from them. Someone is, right now, watching the smoke rise over Riyadh and seeing not a tragedy but a foundation, not destruction but opportunity, not chaos but the raw material from which a new and very specific order is being built. History will judge whether that order is worth the price, whether the normalization of Saudi Arabia and Israel, if it comes, when it comes, justifies what it cost. Whether the destruction of Iran's nuclear program was worth the fuel prices and the dead soldiers and the burning embassies. Whether the new Middle East that emerges from this fire is genuinely more stable, more peaceful, and more just than the old one. That judgment is not available today. It will take years, maybe decades. But while we wait for history to render its verdict, there is one thing we can do right now. We can refuse to accept the simple story. We can reject the clean narrative of victim and aggressor, of attack and response, of innocent bystander and evil perpetrator. We can ask the harder questions. We can follow the money and the weapons and the secret meetings and the strategic logic. Well, we can look at who benefits and who knew what and who said what in rooms that were never meant to be public. We can be the kind of audience that a story this complex, this consequential, and this historically significant actually deserves. The drones have gone quiet tonight over Riyadh. The fires have been put out. The statements have been issued. The news cycle is already moving on. But the story, the real story, the one with 70 years of history behind it and decades of consequences ahead of it, that story is just beginning. And the most important question in it is not the one everyone is asking. It is not who fired at Riyadh. The most important question is who made sure that the firing would happen? Who made sure the conditions existed? Who made sure the moment arrived? And who was already holding the pen, ready to sign, the moment the smoke cleared enough to see? That is the story of whether Israel struck Saudi Arabia to force a war, not with weapons, with something older and far more dangerous, with strategy. There is one more dimension of this story that demands to be told, the Houthis. Because people forget, in the rush of news about Iranian strikes and American bombing campaigns and Saudi air defense systems, that this war did not begin in February 2026. For Saudi Arabia, this war began years earlier, in the mountains of Yemen, where Iranian-backed Houthi rebels have been firing ballistic missiles and launching drones at Saudi cities, Saudi airports, and Saudi oil infrastructure since 2015. Over a decade of attacks, over a decade of Saudi civilians ducking for cover, over a decade of Aramco facilities and desalination plants and military bases, absorbing strikes from an enemy that Iran armed, trained, funded, and directed. Saudi Arabia has been bleeding from Iranian proxies for more than 10 years. And for 10 years, the world largely looked away. When a Houthi drone struck Aramco's Abqaiq facility in September 2019, briefly knocking out nearly 5% of the entire world's daily oil supply in a single attack, the response from the international community was shock, condemnation, and then, remarkably quickly, normalization. Oil prices spiked, markets stabilized, life went on. Iran faced no serious consequence. The Houthis faced no serious consequence. And Saudi Arabia was left to understand, slowly, painfully, that the American security guarantee it had relied upon since the 1970s had limits, real limits. Limits that Iran had already discovered and was actively exploiting. That decade of Houthi attacks is essential context for understanding MBS's willingness to push for war against Iran. This was not impatience. This was not recklessness. This was the decision of a leader who had watched his country absorb years of Iranian proxy aggression, while international partners offered sympathy but not solutions. And when Israel came to him with intelligence, with capability, with a track record of actually being willing to use force against Iranian assets. Israel, which had been covertly striking Iranian weapons shipments to Hezbollah and Syria for years without international repercussion, MBS saw not just a potential partner, but a model. A country that acts, a country that does not wait for UN resolutions and international coalitions and years of fruitless diplomacy. A country that decides and moves. And in his desperation to end the decade-long Houthi nightmare, in his fury at Iranian aggression that the world kept tolerating, MBS made the bet that cost Saudi Arabia its proclaimed neutrality, and may ultimately cost it its political independence from an Israeli American security architecture it can no longer afford to leave. That is the full picture. That is the context in which drones hit Riyadh and missiles, screamed over oil refineries, and the CIA station in the American embassy compound took a direct hit, not random aggression, not unprovoked Iranian madness, the endpoint of a decade of proxy war, secret alliance building, enormous arms transactions, invisible lobbying, and one of the most consequential geopolitical realignments in modern history, all arriving at the same moment, in the same city, in the same burning quarter of the Saudi capital. Remember this. Remember all of it. Because when the peace deal is signed, when the handshakes happen, when the cameras flash on a smiling MBS and a smiling Israeli prime minister standing side by side, the story of how they got there will already be fading from memory. That is how power works. It creates outcomes and then erases the fingerprints. Your job, as someone living through this historic moment, is to remember the fingerprints before they disappear.